The armada arrived like an accusation. They spilled out of dark jumps, black, jagged apertures in the lattice of empty space where no human had ever placed a screwdriver or a satellite. One by one, the ships unfolded, not like manufactured hulks, but like fossils of war. Ribbed hulls the size of mountain ranges, latticed antennae that crawled with sensor motes, pro-systems that glinted with 1,000 weapon barrels. The fleet was a cathedral of menace, calculus of intimidation meant to make the small and the soft bow. They came in thousands, layered in concentric rings, escort flotillas, siege platforms, capital dreadnoughts, the length of moons. Each ship's surface hunched with scar stories of worlds they had burned, trophies of conquered systems, and the whole formation moved with the cold choreography of an organism that had never known mercy. In the black between the stars, their silhouettes cut the light like a hand-closing dot at their center. High above the compression of warcraft hung the flagship, a colossus carved in metallic obsidian, tan-spectured spikes at its keel, a crown of command bridges that shimmered with what the invaders called presence. From that crown radiated the voice of authority and amplified, synthesized tone that the translators named later as mockery and hubris. People of the third planet, it boomed in broken tonalities intended to terrify. We demand submission. Surrender your assets. Lay down your weapons. Your resistance is inefficient. Your species is unremarkable. We offer assimilation or cessation. Below, on a ridge of dark ice in orbit around the inner planet, a single listening post kept steady vigil. Its human commander, Lieutenant Commander Ilias. Roman watched the fleet bloom on his displays with the polite patience of someone watching a weather system. The station's sensors trembled with the passes of enemy scanning waves. The displays painted the invaders in colors no human chart had named. He could have felt fear. Fear would have been honest. Instead, Roman found a certain professional boredom. The fleet had gathered into an obvious formation. It had opened its mouth to roar. He keyed the broadcast. The human voice that answered back was not raised. It did not plead. It did not attempt to explain. It was flat, and for that reason it was worse than a shout. This system is under protection, the voice said. Leave. Do not cross the ERT threshold. There was no flourish to the words, no elaboration, nothing. The translation matrix rendered them in a dozen tongues. The invaders, expecting panic and bargaining, laughed. The laugh broke across frequencies like breaking ice. Protection? Their synthesized, regal tone warped into ridicule. What protections do you boast? Weapons? Mines? Small stones and pathetic ferrous shells? You are a primitive species. Yield and be catalogued. They expected flailing. They expected the sound of desperate negotiation. What they did not expect was silence and unblinking. Implacable stillness that hums like the pressure before a storm, and then the readings began to arrive. At first they were anomalies. A gravity probe in the asteroid ring registered a micro-oscillation that should not exist. A seismometer on a buried moon hummed with patterns like a heartbeat beneath layers of basalt. The invaders' long-range tachyon net reported strange negative energy signatures pockets, where the laws of orbital mechanics bent as if someone had scuffed the page. Margins of the cosmos, those readings multiplied. Asteroids that had been catalogued as barren masses were revealed to be facades. Beneath their regolith were gridworks of crystalline nodes, dark lattice that folded and refolded on themselves. Moons that should have been inert were traced with subsurface channels of engineered mass. The system's barycenter wavered, as if an invisible hand was pressing on the fabric of space itself. On the bridge of the flagship, the tone of mockery frayed. The invader scientists furiously recalculated courses. Their instrument arrays blinked red with unfamiliar algebra. Perturbations, they said. Microfields. Uncatalogued masses. This is structure. Their leader's synthesized voice dropped an octave. Identify the source. From orbit. The human reply came as it had before, calm, unhurried. An absolute. This system belongs to no single vessel. the voice said. "We asked you to leave. This is your final warning." The word final hung there like a blade. It was not. Until the first cruiser tried to fire that the invaders felt the true answer. The cruiser thrust forward and let fly a burst of beam weapon sleek. Linear death lines intended to carve the atmosphere and scatter the inner defenses. The beams began their arcs, singing through the vacuum. They were precisely targeted. They were theoretically unstoppable. Then the beams bent. At first it was a graceful bow, as if the shot had been skewed by a stray solar wind. Then the curvature tightened, a deliberate, impossible, parabolic arc that did not track back to any emitter. The beams coalesced and folded around an invisible seam in space, and when they met again, they struck their origin. The cruiser's forward arrays ignited in a geyser of plasma as its own weapons struck it. Stern dashed first. Panic on the flagship pulsed like a newly emergent fever. Data-flooded consoles' gravity vectors spiked, inertial matrices desynchronized, navigational gyros screamed. Pilots tried to override the course controls and found the controls unresponsive. Their ships were no longer vessels in the convention sense. They were bodies embedded in a medium that had begun to move independently of hull. Projectiles curved into spirals of doom. Missiles dove and then, without logic, reversed and detonated against launching tubes. The capital ship's bridge built to withstand impacts. It's crushed by a gradient shear as the local curvature of space tightened around it like a hand closing on a grape. On Earth, and on the hidden arrays throughout the system. Engineers in black-stitched suits watched spectrographs bloom and then went back to sipping coffee. They were not flurried because this was what they had designed. They had always had two. The reveal was not a single act, but a cascade of realizations. The human network was not a fleet in the classical sense. It was a distributed architecture woven through planets, moons, and asteroid belts. Over centuries, beneath the eyes of complacent surveyors and the arrogance of conquering fleets, humans had threaded the skeleton of their home with machines that learned the calculus of gravity and the secret grammar of space-time. The arrays were ancient as cities and hidden as bones, lattice nodes embedded in the cores of iron moons, translation nodes threaded into the regolith of asteroids, quiet folding engines humming under oceans. They were engineering decisions disguised as geology. Asterisk. Lieutenant Commander Rahman watched one of those nodes pop into the Feedzan orbital armature around an ice moon. Previously cataloged as a mining platform, when activated, its coils did not fire. The coils phased mass fields with such precision that a microtide of curvature passed through the system. The nodes were not engines in the simple sense. They were levers on the fabric itself. A voice came over all channels human, yes, but not shrill or triumphant. It was crystalline, synthesized, but warm with an undercurrent of centuries' patience. "We are not directing ships," said the voice, and the way it said the next words carved the air. "We are directing space." 7 words moved like tectonics beneath the invaders' feet. They had assumed control meant the amplitude of weaponry, the size of guns, the thickness of armor. They had not conceived of control in the sense of geometry, of the competence to change where distance meant. Twofold a path so that a cruiser sailing toward a planet found its destination already curved around a seam. Their mathematics collapsed like old toys. Their sensors spat up errors. Their navigation solved for impossible trajectories and errored out. It did not happen all at once. Ships were not exploded with light. They were rearranged, like leaves in a storm. A destroyer somewhere between the second and third rings found its reaction. Mass useless as the local space-time gradient accelerated one side of the hull and decelerated the other. The hull sheared. The ship twisted and popped apart along seams not meant to admit light. In another vector, a squadron of fighters' sleek, arrogant points of speed were trapped in a corridor of curved space, where forward vectors dissolved and every attempt to turn produced circular paradoxes. They flew in slow motion into themselves until they were dust. The human network behaved as a single mind. Arrayed across the system's bones, they closed off transit corridors. They tightened fields like newswork around whole flotillas. They slid corridors of so-called empty space, so that the invaders' routes overlapped and destroyed each other. It was a choreography of inevitability. Where the invaders tried to outmaneuver, they found the arena itself had been taken from them. Asterisk, and still the humans did not gloat. They rarely raised their voices higher than necessary. Complex algorithms hummed through the arrays, making decisions. Warnings were issued in tones that sounded almost bored at the flagship's frantic screams. Do not enter Region X. Do not attempt Vector. The invaders, the calmness was a kind of insult. As section after section of fleet was disabled, they made a last desperate gamble. A concentrated ramming line. A spear of capital ships aimed at the inner world to crush the heart of human resistance. They would try to force their will by mass and momentum, the oldest law of war. But humans had placed their greatest levers in the places. The invaders had assumed safe in the bulk of moons. Nestled in the tidal flecks of rocky hearts, in the shadowed cores of the largest asteroids. Those levers worked like clock stoppers and seam weavers. When the spear advanced, the human networks did not merely slow or deflect. They rewrote the metric. The spear did not meet a planet. It met compression. For miles, the curvature gradient grew steeper than a cliff. Lead ships slammed into an invisible wall of space-time that crushed holes like shells. Waves of gravitational shear passed through the spear and left the flotilla a broken, gaslit bloom. In the black between the wrecks, ragged survivors flitted with incomprehensible motion ships that had been turned into tight, inverted orbits that looped them like beads on a string around nothing. It was an elegant, cold perfection of physics. For a species built on the assumption that space was an arena, not an instrument, the revelation tasted like horror in the aftermath. When the last hulls floated as fossilized wrecks and the invaders' flag bridge dimmed, the humans did not raise their banners. They extended a hand. A secure link was open to the flagship. The voice that came back was small, not in volume, but in demeanor. The leader of the invaders had realized the concept of defeat. It apologized, offered technical data, suggested treaties odd and unsatisfying concessions of pride. The translation systems relayed confusion, bargaining, and --fear. Humans responded as they always had when given the option, with a practical, restful cruelty that was more humane than their conquerors expected. They would not exterminate. They would not erase. They would enclose. Lieutenant Commander Rahman was one of the small contingent dispatched to board the flagship and to oversee the preservation of prisoners. They docked with the wreck, their suits tapping against bulkheads that still oozed heat from recent collapses. The corridors smelled of scorched iron and old oil. In the great command hall, where spikes had once thrown light like a crown, the leader of the invaders sat gargantuan and still. Around it, in the carved silence, no one sat. No one sat beside her. She was not human. Her presence looked like a layered mosaic of limbs and sensory stalks. She had an arrangement of bioluminescent facets that dimmed when she spoke. Her name in the translator did not carry the gravitas the invaders intended. When they looked at her, they saw exhaustion in the old. Arrogance stripped away an animal that had been brought out into the rain and realized the weather was not a thing she could. Command Rahman stepped forward with the quiet, ordered gait of an engineer used to failing circuits and stubborn welds. Behind him were Marines and diplomats. They prattled with the kind of nervosity born of facing a leader who had been unmade. But Rahman did not carry a blade. He carried a small toolkit and a slate. He approached the invader and, without pausing, without questions, sat down on the empty flagstone beside her. There was a breath, long and meaningless, from the room. Cameras wavered on their mounts like gulls. The invader's facets fluttered. Then the human engineer removed his helmet, placing it beside him like a gesture of trust that imposed no demands. He did not speak. The scene should have been theatrical. It was not. It was simple. A human in a threadbare suit and grease-stained hands sat beside the broken leader of an empire. He did not raise his voice. He did not sneer. He did not offer triumph. The translated words that came after were not a speech, but a fact. Stated as one sets down a tool on a bench. "We will not take your world," Rahman said, soft enough that it could have been private. We will not claim your people as trophies. But you will not leave. You will be contained. You will be allowed to exist under observation. You will learn the equation you did not know you needed." The invader made a sound that the translators rendered as grief or annoyance emotions not designed by its creators. It asked why. Humans, Rahman said, had reached an age of capability where conquest followed no logic. "We are peaceful until threatened," he said. "We do not need your resources, your territories. We needed to make sure no one else would misinterpret our silence as weakness." Rahman's words were not for the invader alone. They were a message to every sentient species that might mistake calm for incapacity. They carried the weight of a species that had learned to bend the rules. Beneath their feet, the invader leaned its crown toward him, facets dimming. No translator could tell whether it reduced itself to silence out of shame or from a dawning respect. Rahman did not reach for ceremony. He looked at the hulled windows, at the broken stars beyond, and then at the troubled face beside him. "No one will sit with me," the invader said after a disquieting moment. "In my systems, to sit is to commit to ally. I have no companions left." Rahman adjusted the strap of his suit and looked at her simply. "Then sit out the rest of it with me," he said. There was no flourish. It was a human courtesy, simple, ineffable, and absolute. He did not force companionship. He offered it like a quiet tool. The invader accepted, if only by a slow relaxation of its facets. Outside, beneath the careful governance of the human arrays, the remaining vessels of the armada were shepherded into a pocket of warp space where they would float and be catalogued. They were allowed to maintain internal systems and culture, to live. Their military teeth had been removed, not by annihilation, but by a rearrangement, so total that their tools no longer affected the world. Inside the flagship, the scene of the engineer and the foreign leader remained small and oddly tender. Other humans came and went, diplomats recording accords, medics tending injuries, but always Rahman sat there. He refused interviews. He refused honors. He was a man who had been an engineer long before the war, and he remained one after. He fixed bent consoles. He tightened bolts. He sat when the treaties were drawn, when the custodial fields were computed, and the invader's fleet secured. The human voice said once more across the emptied vacuum, "We do not seek conquest," it intoned, patient as a planet. "We will not remake you. Remember this, peace is what we offer. But do not mistake our peace for an absence of force." The translation rendered that final clause with a clarity that chilled more than the beam of any weapon. It was not a threat to be flaunted. It was a fact, like gravity itself. In the days that followed, as supply shuttles threaded corridors and the system returned to a wary normal, Rahman would sometimes find the invader awake and watching the stars. No one else would sit beside her. Diplomats preferred distance. The invader's soldiers kept to their cells. But Rahman sat. He would set a small kettle over a heating pad and pour a cup, and sometimes he would speak of simple things, of bridge maintenance. I consent by my wherever why by we I with I am I'm why with that by ritter. The invader listened with facets that flared like questions. When Rahman spoke of the arrays, he did not brag. He simply spoke with the voice of a person who has learned to build wonder as a necessity. People on other stations told stories of how he had acted, how he had offered the final mercy, not through violence, but through the generosity of presence. Some called it saintly. Others called it strategy. Rahman himself never explained beyond the basic truth. Sometimes, when a machine breaks, the only thing to do is sit with it until it remembers how to live. The last line of that chapter was not fireworks, it was silence and a small comprehension spreading across a galaxy like a shadow. Humanity had not conquered by ships. It had made a competency beyond conquest. It had the calculus to alter space. It had the calm to sit with what it had broken. That combination, precision and mercy, was the fearful thing. When the invader's eyes shut for the cycle, Rahman rose, picked up his toolkit, and left the hall. He did not look back. The machine beside him slept quiet and contained. Outside, the remaining stars were as indifferent as ever. But now there was a new truth woven into the black between them. Species that had learned not only to cross space, but to fold it at will. And yet had chosen to leave room for others to learn. Nobody else sat beside her until the human engineer did. Without a word, and the last sound the universe seemed to hear was not a war cry, but a small kettle whispering on a stove in ordinary. Human sound that promised both civilization and, quietly, an unbearable power.